The rearview mirror caught his eyes first. Sharp, cold, half hidden beneath the brim of a worn cap. In the back seat, she clutched a steel box against her chest, like it held the last breath of someone she loved. Rain hammered the windshield. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. A billionaire, disguised as a driver, following his own maid into the dark. But what waited behind that rotting door was a ghost he thought he had buried with his own hands. Before we go any further, drop your time zone and city in the comments. Let's see who's watching at the strangest hour. The night shift at the estate ended at 11. He had watched the clock all evening, his fingers drumming the edge of a mahogany desk worth more than most people earned in a year. He told himself he was being cautious. A man in his position couldn't afford blind trust. But standing in the underground garage, pressing a worn cap over his brow, adjusting the lapels of a jacket borrowed from the driver's locker, he knew this was something else. He had been watching her for 3 weeks. Elena moved through the estate like a shadow, efficient, invisible, silent. She arrived before sunrise, left after dark. In 12 years of running an empire, he had never once bothered to learn a cleaner's schedule. But when his security team flagged her late-night departures, always with that metal box, always to an address in a district he hadn't set foot in for 20 years, something cold settled in his chest. Not suspicion. Something older. Something he couldn't name. He watched through the tinted windshield as she stepped through the rear gate, shoulders hunched against the rain. The metal box was tucked under her arm, wrapped in a plastic bag, pressed close to her body the way a person holds something irreplaceable. She moved quickly, head down, water streaming from the edges of her hood. He gave her half a block, then pulled out of the lot. The GPS on the dash already had the address loaded. He had looked it up that afternoon. Cross Meridian Lane, a stretch of row houses built in the 1940s, half of them condemned, the rest surviving on memory alone. The kind of neighborhood that existed in the blind spots of the city's development plans. The kind of place that men like him had once walked through without seeing. The kind of place he had deliberately stopped thinking about. He kept 2 cars between them on the highway, then one, then none, as the roads narrowed and the street lights thinned out. Through the rearview mirror, he caught her reflection just once, her eyes in the glass, tired, heavy with something unspoken. Not fear, not guilt, something far quieter. He couldn't look away. The car slowed at a cracked stretch of pavement. She stepped out, pulled the hood tighter, and turned into an alley swallowed by shadow, completely unaware that the man who signed her paychecks was following her on foot, expensive leather shoes sinking into the mud. He had expected many things: a second family, a side arrangement, something that could be explained, filed, and forgotten. He had not expected this. She stopped in front of a narrow house at the end of the alley, paint stripped to bare wood, one shutter hanging by a single nail, a window on the upper floor held together with tape and cardboard. It looked like the kind of place that the city had given up on. He pressed himself against the wall of the adjacent building, rainwater running down the back of his collar. She knocked, 3 taps, then 2. A pause, then one more. A signal. He watched through a gap in the fence as the door opened just wide enough to let her in. He moved closer, circling to the far side of the house where a broken window offered a narrow view of the interior. He crouched in the mud, the hem of his jacket dragging in a puddle, and looked through the gap in the torn curtain. The room was lit by a single lamp. Bare walls, a cracked ceiling, furniture that looked like it had been salvaged from the street. And there, against the far wall, pushed beneath the window, a hospital-style bed, the kind with adjustable rails and a foam wedge pillow. She was already kneeling beside it. He watched as she unwrapped the metal box with the same care a surgeon gives instruments. Deliberate, unhurried, reverent. She set each item on the bedside table in a specific order. Pill bottles, sorted by time of day. A folded medical chart, annotated in her handwriting. A small stack of bills, banded together, 10s and 20s, the kind of money accumulated slowly, over months, in small amounts. He felt something shift in his chest. A tightening he hadn't experienced in a long time. This wasn't stolen property. There was no contraband, no hidden scheme, no second life being run at his expense. What he was looking at was sacrifice made visible, the physical evidence of someone giving away the margins of their own life, week after week, to keep another person alive. And then he saw the figure in the bed. Thin, older than he had expected, lying still except for the slow rise and fall of breathing, one arm resting on top of the blanket, skin pale and papery in the lamp's yellow light. Elena was adjusting the pillow, speaking in a low voice, too quiet for him to hear through the glass. He pressed closer. The figure shifted. The arm moved, and the blanket slipped, and the lamplight fell across the shoulder, and there, just below the collarbone, was a scar, a deep one, irregular, the kind left not by surgery but by impact. He had seen that scar before. He had been there the night it was made. 22 years. He had spent 22 years building walls between himself and that night. He had moved cities, changed industries, restructured his identity around success, so complete and so consuming that there had been no space left for what came before it. He had told himself it was survival. That you couldn't lead a company, couldn't drive growth, couldn't make the decisions that power required if you were weighed down by every regret. He had been very good at believing that. The scar ended it in an instant. His back hit the fence. He wasn't aware of moving. The mud soaked through his trousers as he stood in the rain with his hands pressed flat against the rotting wood, breathing through his teeth, trying to hold a version of himself together that had just quietly come apart. The accident had been ruled unavoidable. The police report said as much. Road conditions, low visibility. The other driver had survived, technically, transferred to a long-term care facility upstate, no next of kin listed. He had instructed his attorney to handle the settlement, to ensure the matter was closed cleanly. He had never followed up. He had told himself the man had probably recovered, moved on. He had never let himself imagine that recovery had not come. That moved on had simply meant moved somewhere smaller, somewhere cheaper, somewhere entirely outside his line of sight. The sound of Elena's voice carried through the broken window, still too quiet to make out the words. And then the figure in the bed responded. Not in a whisper this time, in a voice roughened by years of disuse, frayed at the edges but clear enough to travel through rain and glass and 22 years of constructed distance. He said a name. He said it like a question, like he wasn't sure he was still allowed to use it. The name was his. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He stood in the mud outside a dying house in the part of the city he had stopped looking at. And he heard his own name spoken by the man whose life had bent permanently out of shape the night a younger, reckless, less careful version of him had made a decision that he had spent 2 decades not thinking about. Inside, Elena answered. She said something quiet and even. He caught only the end of it. Not because he deserves it, she said. Because it is the right thing to do, He had spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who managed him. Advisors, lawyers, handlers, press teams. People who knew what to say to move him towards the outcome they needed. He had become very good at recognizing that kind of language, and very good at discounting it. This was different. She wasn't performing. She wasn't managing him. She didn't even know he was there. She was saying it to the man in the bed, and she was saying it the way people say things they have already made peace with. Not as a declaration, but as a fact, as settled as weather. The arrogance he had spent years mistaking for confidence cracked clean through. It wasn't guilt that he felt standing there. He had felt guilt before, a manageable thing, compartmentalized and controlled. What he felt now was something heavier, the weight of 2 decades of chosen blindness falling all at once. He walked back to the car. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time without starting the engine. Then he picked up his phone. The chief of medicine answered on the second ring. He didn't apologize for the hour. He didn't explain. He said, "I need a full care team at the Lakeview facility by 6 in the morning. Private suite, full diagnostic. Whatever he needs, I don't want to hear about cost. Do you understand me?" He ended the call before the man could ask questions. Then he sat in the silence and waited for the second call he knew was coming. It came 4 minutes later. An unregistered number. A voice he didn't recognize. Flat, measured, professional in the particular way that people who deliver consequences for a living tend to be professional. "You're aware," the voice said, "that revisiting this arrangement carries significant exposure." "For you." He said nothing. "The settlement was final. The documentation is clean. What you're considering would draw attention to a matter that has been closed for more than 2 decades. The implications for your current position, your board standing, the pending acquisition, these are not abstract concerns." He watched the rain streak down the windshield. He had built an entire framework of decision-making around exactly this kind of analysis. The weighting of risk against return, the calculation of what a thing was worth against what it would cost. He had made that framework into a philosophy, and the philosophy into a reputation, and the reputation into a life. He understood, sitting in the car outside that ruined house, that the framework had been the problem all along. It hadn't been strategy. It had been a very sophisticated way of not having to feel responsible for what his decisions left behind. "Send whatever you need to send," he said. He ended the call. He got out of the car and stood in the rain. He looked up at the window where the lamp was still burning. Inside, Elena was still moving, checking, adjusting, maintaining, doing the work that should never have fallen to her, for a man who had been written off by every system that was supposed to protect him, keeping something alive that the world had decided was no longer worth keeping. He pulled out his phone again and called his driver. "Bring the SUV and call Dr. Reyes. Tell her we need the trauma unit prepped. Tell her it's personal." He didn't go back inside. He waited on the curb in the rain until he heard the sound of tires on wet pavement, until the headlights swept the end of the alley and the vehicle pulled up alongside him. He opened the rear door himself, and he sat in the back, and he thought about what a person was supposed to say after 22 years of silence. He didn't have the answer. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't looking for a way around the question. She heard the ambulance before she saw it. Elena was at the window. She had taken to standing there in the final hour before midnight, watching the alley the way people watch for weather, when the blue light swept across the ceiling. She turned. She looked at the man in the bed. He was already awake, already watching her with the particular expression he wore when he was preparing himself for something he couldn't control. "It's all right," she said. Force of habit. The door opened without a knock. He walked in without the cap, without the jacket, without any of the things he had used that evening to be someone else. He was just himself, tired, rain-damp, holding no particular expression on his face. His eyes moved to the bed, to the man lying in it, and he stopped walking. The room was very quiet. Elena stood between them. She did not speak. She had learned, over the years, that some silences needed to be allowed their full weight before anyone tried to fill them. He took another step forward. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore," he said. He was speaking to her, but he was looking at the man in the bed. "Either of you." She looked at him for a long moment. She had worked in that house for 4 years. She had cleaned his offices, prepared his meeting rooms, served coffee to men who made decisions that moved the world. She had never once believed he would end up here, in this room, saying those words. And yet, she stepped aside. 3 days later, in a private room at the city's finest medical facility, the machines breathed steadily, and the light through the window was clean and pale. When the man in the bed opened his eyes, he did not look at the ceiling the way people do when they are waking into uncertainty. He looked directly at the chair beside the bed. There was no hatred in his face, only something quieter. Something that the billionaire had no right to receive, and received anyway. The work of rebuilding had only just begun.
That's where we leave them. Not with a verdict, not with a clean resolution. Just a man sitting beside a bed he should have visited 20 years earlier, and a woman who never asked to carry what she carried, but carried it anyway, quietly, without recognition, because she believed it was right. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment. Names, locations, and details have been changed, but the questions it raises are real. How much of what we call success is built on things we chose not to look at? And how rare, how genuinely rare, is it to meet someone who does the right thing not because anyone is watching, but simply because it needs to be done? If this story moved you in any way, I'd love to know. Drop it in the comments. And if you're new here, welcome to QH Incredible Stories. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. We'll see you in the next one.